In the early 1500s, it felt like nothing could stop the Ottoman Empire. Like a thundercloud stretching across a summer sky, their power loomed large and dark over the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, and now Europe. They weren't new invaders. The Ottomans had been carving out their empire since the 14th century, but under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, things accelerated. He was no ordinary ruler. Charismatic, brilliant, ruthless, Suleiman didn't just want dominance. He wanted legacy. And for that, Vienna, imperial capital of the Habsburgs, was the glittering prize at the heart of Europe. The Ottomans had already crushed the once mighty Byzantine Empire. They stormed Constantinople in 1453, turning the seat of Eastern Christianity into the capital of Islam's most powerful empire. They ruled the Balkans, had Hungary by the throat, and their navy made the Mediterranean their lake. Europe, meanwhile, was fractured. German princes bickered, France and the Habsburgs fought, and the Reformation was tearing apart Catholic unity. It wasn't a question of if the Ottomans would push further, it was when. Suleiman's armies were legendary. Janissaries, elite infantry raised from Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, stood shoulder to shoulder in terrifying discipline. Their artillery was second to none. They had engineers who could build bridges in hours, cavalry that moved with lightning speed, and logistics that could support campaigns deep into foreign territory. This wasn't some wild eastern horde. This was an early modern military machine, and Vienna was its next test. Why Vienna? It wasn't the biggest city. It wasn't the richest. But its symbolic value was immense. It was the gateway to the Holy Roman Empire and, in many eyes, the last bastion of Latin Christendom. Taking Vienna would send a shudder through all of Europe. It would show that not even the heart of the West was safe. And from there? The road to Rome, to Paris, perhaps even to the Atlantic, might open up. In the Habsburg court, they saw the storm coming. Charles V, and later his brother Ferdinand I, scrambled to shore up defenses. But organizing a coherent resistance in such a fractured continent was like trying to herd cats. Still, even cats get scared when something big enough shows up. And Suleiman was big enough. His declaration of war in 1529 wasn't subtle. He marched west with roughly 120,000 men, an enormous army for the time. Every village, town, and fortress along the Danube braced for impact. Most fell. As they approached Vienna, panic spread. Nobles fled. Merchants packed their things. And inside the city, under the command of Count Nicholas von Salm, barely 20,000 defenders began to prepare for what looked like certain doom. They reinforced crumbling medieval walls, dug ditches, flooded fields, and prayed. Literally. The churches of Vienna rang constantly with pleas to heaven. The Ottomans, after all, were seen not just as invaders, but as divine punishment for Europe's sins. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of civilizations. The Ottomans brought not just soldiers, but imams, cooks, masons, and scribes. They traveled like a nation on the move. Vienna became more than a military target. It was a test of faith, a point where two worlds collided. And in the minds of many, the soul of Europe hung in the balance. But beneath the sweeping flags and the cries of holy war, something deeper was at play. Power. Trade. Control. Vienna sat near vital routes between East and West. Whoever held it could dominate the flow of goods, ideas, and influence. And for Suleiman, who styled himself as Caesar, as the rightful heir to both Rome and Muhammad, seizing Vienna was the logical next step in his imperial saga. But empires rarely move without resistance. Even fractured, Europe had its pockets of strength. And as the Ottoman columns pressed forward, hauling cannon and supplies across soaked ground, whispers began to rise from the Alps to the Baltic. Could Vienna stand? The siege of Vienna in 1529 began not with a trumpet blast, but with mud. Heavy rains had dogged Suleiman's march through Hungary, turning roads into swamps and wagons into sinking burdens. His massive army, nearly 120,000 strong when it set out, was reduced by attrition and disease long before they ever glimpsed the spires of Vienna. Artillery was abandoned in the mire, horses collapsed, and supplies dwindled. Yet still, they came, relentless, hungry, driven by ambition and the command of a sultan who had never tasted defeat. On September 27th, the Ottoman host arrived outside Vienna. The city, defended by roughly 20,000 soldiers and civilians under Count Nicholas von Salm and Wilhelm von Roggendorf, braced for impact. They had no illusions. The city's medieval walls were barely over 6 feet thick in places, utterly inadequate against the massive Turkish cannons, had they arrived in full. But fortune had played a cruel joke on the invaders. Most of their heavy siege equipment had been left behind, mired in Hungary's autumn rains. Still, the threat was dire. The Ottomans dug trenches and tunnels, preparing to undermine Vienna's defenses. Explosives were placed beneath bastions, attempting to collapse sections of the wall. Every night, sappers clawed through the earth like termites. Every day, the defenders countermined, listening for the faint echo of digging, then bursting into the tunnels with swords and fire. The war beneath the walls was as brutal as any fought above. Inside the city, fear and fatigue took their toll. Food was rationed. Disease spread. The defenders had to plug breaches daily, repair collapsing ramparts, and keep watch night after night. Yet despite the chaos, the city did not break. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps divine providence. Perhaps the stubbornness of men who had nowhere else to run. The Ottomans launched repeated assaults. Waves of Janissaries crashed against the walls, their war cries piercing the damp October air. Scaling ladders rose and fell. Fires raged. Smoke clouded the vision of friend and foe alike. The defenders used boiling oil, pitch, and everything at hand. Women joined the fight, hurling rocks from rooftops. It wasn't just a garrison under attack, it was a city united in sheer, teeth-gritted survival. But each attack was repelled. Slowly, cracks began to form, not in the walls, but in the Ottoman resolve. Supplies were thinning. The weather worsened. Winter's breath crept into the camp, chilling bones and morale alike. Suleiman himself, once a picture of calm majesty, began to feel the strain. Reports trickled in of Habsburg reinforcements moving in the region. He could not afford to be trapped in a hostile land, with stretched supply lines and faltering troops. By mid-October, it became clear Vienna would not fall. On October 14, 1529, Suleiman ordered the retreat. The siege, though fierce and devastating, had failed. What had begun as a march of conquest ended in muddy withdrawal. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers never made it home. The roads were littered with broken wagons, discarded weapons, and frozen corpses. The mighty Sultan, for the first time in his reign, had been denied his prize. The shock reverberated far beyond the battlefield. In the Ottoman world, the failure at Vienna was a blemish on an otherwise unbroken string of triumphs. While not catastrophic militarily, it was, after all, a retreat rather than a rout. It was symbolically devastating. The image of Suleiman as the invincible Padishah was cracked. His aura dimmed. His generals murmured. His enemies rejoiced. In Europe, the victory sparked something rare, unity, however fleeting. For once, Protestant and Catholic princes saw common cause in resisting Ottoman expansion. Pamphlets glorified the defenders. Paintings immortalized the siege. Vienna became more than a city, it became a symbol of Europe's defiance. The line that had held. And for Vienna itself, the scars remained. The city had survived, but just barely. Its walls were ruined. Its people exhausted. But from the rubble, something new would rise. Fortifications were expanded. Lessons were learned. And perhaps most importantly, a message was sent: the Ottomans were mighty, but not unstoppable. Yet even as Suleiman returned to Constantinople, he had not given up. Vienna had survived, yes. But the story was far from over. The borderlands would remain blood-soaked for generations. Raids, skirmishes, and proxy wars would plague Central Europe. The shadow of the crescent moon still hung over the Danube. And somewhere, deep in the courts of both empires, leaders were already whispering the same thought: next time. The decades that followed the failed siege of 1529 did not bring peace. They brought tension. An uneasy quiet, like the air before a storm. The Ottomans hadn't given up on Vienna, and Europe hadn't forgotten the razor's edge they'd been balanced on. But both sides needed time. Time to rebuild, to rethink, and, most importantly, to prepare. Suleiman the Magnificent would never return to Vienna. He died in 1566, during the siege of Siegedvar, his heart literally buried on European soil. His successors inherited an empire still vast and powerful, but increasingly strained. Administrative cracks widened. Succession struggles festered. Corruption gnawed at the edges of Ottoman strength. Yet their ambition in the West remained intact. On the European side, things weren't much better. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christendom. Civil wars, religious purges, and brutal inquisitions tore nations apart from within. The 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618, would devastate Central Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Empire, for an entire generation. It seemed at times that Christendom was more likely to collapse from internal division than foreign invasion. But even in chaos, borders shift. After the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Europe slowly began to recover. New powers emerged, while old ones reasserted themselves. The Habsburgs, though battered, remained determined to defend the eastern frontier. Austria, in particular, began investing in permanent fortifications, professionalized military training, and intelligence gathering on their eastern neighbor. They knew the Ottomans hadn't forgotten. And neither had they. By the late 1600s, the geopolitical chessboard was reset. The Ottoman Empire, under the Copperle viziers, saw a brief resurgence. These capable administrators revitalized the army, cleaned up court politics, and brought a new sense of purpose. And with that purpose came expansion. The Ottomans struck at Crete, at Poland, and deep into Transylvania. Their confidence returned. At the center of this renewed drive stood Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. Tall, proud, and ambitious to the point of arrogance, he believed destiny had chosen him to succeed where Suleiman had fallen short. Kara Mustafa wasn't just planning a campaign, he envisioned a legacy. A triumph that would make his name eternal, echoing in the halls of Topkapi Palace and across the minarets of Istanbul. He would take Vienna. And he would do it in glory. The Ottomans struck in 1683. Once again, they pushed through Hungary with a massive army, over 150,000 men, the largest force ever sent against a European city at that point. But this time, Europe was no longer caught off guard. The Habsburgs, learning from 1529, had reinforced Vienna's defenses, updated their artillery, and improved city planning to support prolonged resistance. More importantly, they had forged an alliance. The Holy League, a rare coalition of Catholic forces, had been forming quietly in the background. With the papacy pulling strings and Poland's King John III Sobieski taking the lead, the alliance agreed, if Vienna were threatened again, they would answer. Sobieski, a battle-tested leader with a cavalry force famous across Europe, was Vienna's insurance policy. Still, when the Ottomans began their approach, panic again gripped the city. Emperor Leopold I and his court fled, as had Ferdinand a century earlier, leaving the defense in the hands of Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg. Supplies were rushed inside. Trenches were dug. The city braced. And this time, they knew the Ottomans were bringing everything. Kara Mustafa Pasha approached the siege not just as a military endeavor but as a performance. He had silks flown in for his command tent, brought gold-flecked furnishings, and had a victory sermon prepared in advance. He believed Vienna would fall quickly, just as so many other European fortresses had. And in those early days, it seemed possible. His engineers set to work with ruthless efficiency, digging approach trenches, constructing redoubts, and mining the walls. But time was slipping. Unlike in 1529, when Vienna was largely isolated, this time the defenders were counting on help. The Ottomans needed to break the city before the relief force could arrive. And as the weeks dragged on, cracks began to appear, not just in the walls, but in Karam Mustafa's plan. Inside Vienna, the defense was holding. Starhemberg refused to surrender. Despite being vastly outnumbered and constantly shelled, the Viennese defenders managed to plug breaches, intercept sappers, and maintain order. The spirit of survival that had sustained the city in 1529 burned even brighter now. And on the horizon, help was coming. John III Sobieski, riding at the head of a massive relief army of Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, and his famed Polish winged hussars, was closing in. His march was fast, calculated, and carried the weight of Christendom's hopes. For Karam Mustafa, the siege was no longer just about Vienna, it was about beating the clock. And the clock was ticking loud. At dawn on July 14, 1683, the Second Great Ottoman Siege of Vienna officially began. This time, there would be no rain-soaked failure to get artillery to the front. Karam Mustafa Pasha had arrived prepared. Massive cannons thundered from redoubts, pounding Vienna's bastions day and night. A sea of tents stretched across the countryside, shimmering with Ottoman banners and the glint of curved scimitars. From atop the surrounding hills, the capital of Austria seemed like a prize already halfway claimed. But Vienna was not Constantinople, and 1683 was not 1453. Though outnumbered, the defenders had spent months turning their city into a fortress. Starhemberg, commanding fewer than 15,000 soldiers and militia, knew every wall, ditch, and blind corner. He had stored rations, preserved gunpowder, trained civilians. When the Ottomans encircled the city, he ordered every gate sealed. No one would leave. No one would surrender. Not this time. The Ottoman siege tactics were as relentless as they were sophisticated. Sappers burrowed beneath the city's defenses, planting massive charges of gunpowder. Dozens of mining tunnels spiderwebbed under the outer walls. With each explosion, whole sections of ramparts crumbled. Ottoman infantry rushed forward, only to meet musket volleys and boiling pitch. On the surface, cannon barrages rained iron down like thunder from a wrathful god. Still, the defenders clung on. Inside Vienna, fear began to turn to fury. Priests led prayers in the streets. Children carried buckets of water to the ramparts. Housewives packed powder cartridges. Anyone who could lift a shovel helped rebuild walls. The city's population, starved and sleepless, became a single desperate organism, fighting for survival. The smell of smoke never left the air. For Karam Mustafa, however, the siege was dragging. Days became weeks. Summer turned to early autumn. Still no breakthrough. His advisors urged caution. Intelligence reports warned of an incoming relief force. But the Grand Vizier dismissed them. He believed the city was close to collapse. Morale was fraying. Food was running low. All he needed was one more push. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Alps, help was galloping forward. John III Sobieski, King of Poland and one of Europe's most capable commanders, was leading a coalition army toward Vienna. He had answered the call for help not out of pure altruism, but because he knew the fate of Poland was tied to the fate of the West. If Vienna fell, Poland would not be far behind. His army, made up of Poles, Austrians, Saxons, and Bavarians, numbered around 70,000. Not quite half the size of the Ottoman hosts, but battle-hardened, fast-moving, and united in purpose. The approach to Vienna was brutal. Forests, rivers, and mountain passes had to be navigated with speed. Supplies had to be hauled across rough terrain. But Sobieski drove his army forward with fierce resolve. By early September, he had reached the hills outside Vienna. The Ottomans, dug in and focused entirely on the city, were largely unaware that death was descending from behind. On September 11, 1683, the Christian coalition took positions in the forested ridges of the Vienna woods. Sobieski observed the enemy camp from the heights of Kahlenberg Hill. He saw the sea of tents, the siege trenches, and the exhausted, bleeding city below. And he knew the moment had come. At dawn the next day, on September 12, the coalition attacked. The battle began with Austrian and German infantry launching a coordinated assault from the west, drawing Ottoman attention away from the ridge. It worked. Kara Mustafa scrambled to reinforce his lines. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had allowed the bulk of his army to spread wide, encircling Vienna, rather than keeping a mobile reserve. That afternoon, Sobieski unleashed his final blow. Down the slope of the Kahlenberg thundered the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. 18,000 horsemen, led by the legendary Polish winged hussars, erupted from the treeline. With wings of wood and feathers attached to their backs, designed to whistle and terrify, the hussars cut through the Ottoman ranks like a scythe through grain. The ground shook. The sun glinted off armor. It was not a charge, it was a reckoning. Ottoman forces collapsed under the pressure. Panic spread through the ranks. What had been a siege became a slaughter. Kara Mustafa fled the field, his dream of conquering Vienna shattered beyond repair. Inside the city, the battered defenders watched the Ottoman banners fall. Cheers erupted. Starhemberg, gaunt and bleeding, wept on the walls. Vienna had not only held, it had been saved in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. A coalition of nations, faiths, and languages had come together to push back the tide. For Europe, September 12 was more than a victory. It was a turning point. The high tide of Ottoman expansion had broken against the walls of Vienna, and the charge of Sobieski had slammed the door shut. The battlefield outside Vienna was a sea of silence the morning after September 12. Tents lay abandoned. Siege trenches gaped like scars in the earth. Scattered weapons and broken cannon littered the field. The Ottomans were gone, fled eastward in disarray. But the echoes of the cavalry charge that shattered them would ripple through history for centuries. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the man who had dared to finish what Suleiman began, rode back to the Ottoman capital in shame. His army had been not only defeated but humiliated. The loss at Vienna wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a monumental disaster. His gamble had cost tens of thousands of lives, drained the empire's treasury, and shattered the illusion of Ottoman invincibility. The punishment came swiftly. On December 25, 1683, in Belgrade, by direct order of the Sultan, Kara Mustafa was executed, strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method for nobles. But while the Ottomans mourned and buried their ambitions, Europe celebrated and transformed. The victory at Vienna lit a fire across the continent. Suddenly, the seemingly endless pressure from the east had been broken. The narrative flipped. No longer was Christian Europe the trembling target of Ottoman expansion, it was the force on the rise. The shift was psychological as much as it was military. From Spain to Poland, poets, priests, and politicians hailed the miracle at Vienna. Church bells rang. Victory sermons echoed in cathedrals. John III Sobieski was proclaimed the savior of Christendom. Yet the true significance of Vienna lay not just in that singular day, but in what followed. The defeat sparked a chain reaction. The Holy League, emboldened and now validated, went on the offensive. Over the next 16 years, what became known as the Great Turkish War saw Christian forces push the Ottomans back across Hungary and the Balkans. Battle after battle, fortress after fortress, the empire lost ground. In 1697, the Ottomans suffered another devastating defeat at the Battle of Zenta. The final blow came in 1699, with the Treaty of Karlowitz, a humiliating peace that forced the empire to cede vast territories in Central Europe. The age of Ottoman expansion was over. Meanwhile, Europe underwent a quiet revolution. The victory had proved the power of cooperation. Poles, Austrians, Germans, and others had fought side by side. It planted the seeds of modern alliances. And it forced military reform. States that had once relied on mercenaries and disorganized levies began investing in professional armies, national militias, and updated fortifications. The siege of Vienna had exposed weaknesses and inspired innovation. Vienna itself was reborn. The battered city, once viewed as the eastern outpost of Christendom, transformed into a cultural and intellectual powerhouse. In the decades following the siege, it became a beacon of the Enlightenment, home to music, philosophy, and imperial grandeur. The trauma of 1683 shaped the city's architecture, its spirit, and its role as a buffer zone between East and West. But the story didn't end in Europe. The failure at Vienna changed the Ottoman Empire internally, too. The confidence of its golden age had cracked. Though it would remain a powerful state for centuries, the tone shifted. More inward-looking. More defensive. The empire, once aggressive and forward-leaning, began to entrench, managing decline instead of chasing expansion. Historians would later call 1683 the start of the Ottoman retreat. And geopolitically, Vienna marked the beginning of a major pivot. With the eastern threat diminished, European powers turned their eyes elsewhere, toward the oceans, toward colonies, and toward each other. The age of empire was dawning. With the Ottomans reeling, Europe began to dominate global trade, redraw borders far beyond the continent, and project power in ways unthinkable before. The siege hadn't just protected a city, it had cleared the runway for a new world order. Even religion played its part. The Pope, thrilled at the unity of Catholic forces in Vienna's defense, attempted to leverage the momentum to rebuild papal influence. Though the Reformation had permanently altered the religious landscape, Vienna reminded many of the emotional power that still resided in a shared Christian identity. Crusading fervor had made a brief return, and even in its passing, it left behind new expectations for leadership, legitimacy, and unity. The siege of Vienna had begun as a high-stakes gamble by an ambitious vizier. It ended as a historical hinge. After 1683, maps changed. Ideas changed. Empires rose, and others began to fade. It was not the first time the city had stood on the edge of ruin, but it was the last time it would do so with the entire fate of Europe hanging in the balance. And for generations after, parents would tell their children how close the world had come to changing forever, if not for a stubborn city, a relentless king, and a thundering cavalry charge that echoed through the heart of Europe. When the dust finally settled and Vienna exhaled, Europe was not the same continent it had been before the siege. Something fundamental had shifted, not just on the battlefield, but in the collective consciousness of empires, kings, and commoners alike. The Ottoman siege of 1683 had not merely failed, it had cracked open a new era. And in that crack, history pivoted. For the Ottoman Empire, the blow was more than military. It was psychological. The veneer of inevitable dominance had been shattered. The empire's mystique, the aura that had once made cities surrender at the mere rumor of an approaching vizier, was gone. The campaign had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and drained resources, but more than anything, it had shown the limits of Ottoman reach. Even the most disciplined janissaries and the most fearsome cavalry could not conquer the heart of Europe. And now, the rest of the continent knew it. In the decades that followed, the Ottomans found themselves increasingly on the defensive. Their military still held formidable power, but cracks widened. Naval superiority slipped away. Eastern provinces grew restive. The balance of power was shifting westward. European armies, once fractured and feudal, began to adopt standardized training, advanced firearms, and scientific military theories that outpaced the older models used in Istanbul. Internally, the empire became more cautious. Reform movements, fearing another Vienna-like humiliation, emerged but often stalled. Grand viziers now ruled more carefully, wary of bold campaigns. Politically, the empire turned inward, managing the sultan's image, navigating court intrigue, and trying to stabilize a vast territory with increasingly limited ambition. The empire would endure into the 20th century, but its dreams of conquering Europe quietly dissolved on the fields outside Vienna. For the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs, however, the siege marked a rebirth. Long plagued by division and religious conflict, they suddenly found themselves cast as defenders of Western civilization. The once embattled Austrian dynasty took center stage in European politics. Vienna, far from being a fragile border town, became a political powerhouse and cultural magnet. Emperors ruled from its palaces, and ideas poured in from across the continent. Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, they would all follow in the footsteps of that improbable survival story. The political ripple effect spread far. The victory inspired a generation of alliance building. Nations learned that unity, even if temporary, could deflect even the largest threats. The Holy League of 1684 became a model for future coalitions, including the Grand Alliance against Louis XIV and even the eventual cooperation against Napoleon. Europe, so long a patchwork of rivalries, began to imagine itself as a network of shared interests, however unstable those might be. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the siege was in how it reframed East and West. Before 1683, there was a persistent fear that Islam might sweep over Europe in a second wave, completing what the Moors and the early caliphates had once tried. The Ottomans had fed this narrative. They called themselves Ghazis, holy warriors, and pitched their conquests as a continuation of divine struggle. After Vienna, that myth faltered. The clash between civilizations gave way to more nuanced relationships. Trade, diplomacy, and espionage took center stage. Vienna became the borderland not of fear, but of fusion. A place where Ottoman envoys met European aristocrats, where Turkish coffee became a Viennese staple, where styles, words, and habits crossed back and forth over now softened borders. The memory of battle faded, but the cultural exchange endured. In the world beyond Europe, the impact was just as real. With the Ottomans no longer an existential threat, European powers felt free to expand their ambitions elsewhere. Colonization surged. Britain looked west to the Americas. France turned south and east. The Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese carved new empires abroad. And all of this was underpinned by the sense that Europe was now unchallenged at home. The fall of Vienna would have meant a continent forever split between Islam and Christianity. Its survival meant something else: the rise of European global dominance. Of course, not all lessons were learned wisely. The victory at Vienna also hardened some prejudices. It encouraged a self-image of European moral superiority that would later fuel imperialism and religious bigotry. The savior of Christendom narrative, while inspiring, also made it easier to justify future conquests in the name of civilization. History rarely moves in straight lines, it swings between victories and their consequences. Yet if one steps back, the moment remains astonishing. A vast empire had thrown everything it had at a single city, believing it would break the will of a continent. Instead, the opposite happened. That city, cold, hungry, cracked, and nearly buried under siege works, refused to fall. And in doing so, it set in motion a chain of events that redefined power, faith, and the future. Centuries later, you can still stand on the Kahlenberg and look out over Vienna. The skyline has changed. Domes and spires now share space with steel and glass, but the story still whispers in the wind. Somewhere down below, the echoes of hammers rebuilding walls, the distant cry of a winged cavalryman, the cheers of a liberated city still drift in the stone. The siege of Vienna didn't just save a city. It changed the story of Europe.